He thought he was just a stranger on the street, but the truth he discovered would connect his past in unimaginable ways. The opulent ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers, casting a warm glow over the elegantly dressed guests who mingled, their laughter mingling with the gentle notes of a string quartet. Chris, a striking figure in a tailored navy suit, stood at the podium, his heart pounding with an unusual sense of emptiness. He had spent his life climbing the corporate ladder, accumulating wealth and accolades, yet tonight, as he delivered his speech on the importance of philanthropy, he felt a growing void within. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chris began, his voice steady, yet lacking the fervor he had hoped to convey. "We are gathered here tonight to remind ourselves of the power we wield to change lives. Each dollar you donate tonight will go towards providing shelter, food, and hope to those who have been forgotten." He paused, scanning the crowd, seeking connection in their faces. "Let us not forget that our success is intertwined with the well-being of our community." Applause erupted, but Chris felt detached, as if he were watching himself from a distance. The throng of guests clinked glasses and exchanged pleasantries, but in that moment, all he could hear was the echo of his own words ringing hollow in his ears. He stepped down from the podium, a practiced smile plastered on his face, but inside he wrestled with a sense of discontent that he could not shake. Later, as the gala concluded and guests began to filter out, Chris decided to take a different route home. The city streets, usually bustling with life, felt unusually quiet. He wandered, lost in thought, until he came across a dimly lit sidewalk where a figure huddled against the cold, holding a tattered sign that read, "Anything helps." Intrigued, Chris approached, his heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and compassion. "Hey there," Chris said softly, crouching down to meet the man's gaze. The man looked up, his face lined with the hardships of life on the streets. His clothes were threadbare, but his eyes sparkled with a depth that caught Chris off guard. "Evening," the man replied, a hint of surprise in his voice. "Not many stop to chat anymore." He shifted slightly, revealing his name was Hank, a name that seemed to carry stories of its own. "I'm Chris," he introduced himself. "I just came from a charity event. I wanted to see if you needed anything." Hank chuckled softly, a sound that seemed to resonate with the weight of his experiences. "I've got everything I need right here." He gestured to the small pile of belongings beside him, but a warm meal wouldn't hurt. Chris nodded, feeling an unfamiliar tug at his heartstrings. "What's your story, Hank?" he asked, genuinely interested. With a deep breath, Hank began to share his life. "I used to have a job, a family, a roof over my head, but life has a way of knocking you down when you least expect it. I lost everything, my job, my wife, and eventually my home." He paused, glancing at the passers-by who ignored him. "But I found a way to keep going. Every dollar I get, I share it with those in need. There's always someone who's worse off than me." Chris was taken aback. "You give away what little you have?" he asked, incredulous. "Absolutely," Hank replied, his voice firm. "It's not about what you've lost, it's about what you can give. Kindness doesn't require wealth, it just needs a heart." Moved by Hank's selflessness, Chris reached into his pocket, pulling out a generous donation. "Here," he said, pressing the bills into Hank's hand. "I want you to have this, and I promise to come back. There must be more I can do." Hank looked at the money, then back at Chris, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief on his face. "You don't have to do this, you know. I'm just a guy on the street." "Maybe. But everyone deserves a chance," Chris said, his voice steady. "You've inspired me tonight more than you know." As Chris turned to leave, he glanced back at Hank, who wore a smile that seemed to light up the dark street. The encounter lingered in Chris's mind as he walked home, a sense of purpose slowly replacing the emptiness he had felt just hours before. Little did he know that this chance meeting would lead him on a journey that would change not only his life, but also reveal connections he never expected. Chris found himself walking the familiar path to the park where he had first met Hank. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden hue over the city, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming flowers. Each visit had become a highlight of his week, a counterbalance to the sterile, high-stakes world of corporate deals and luxury cars. He carried a bag filled with sandwiches, fresh fruit, and a couple of bottled waters, feeling a sense of anticipation as he approached the familiar spot. Hank was there, seated on the same patch of concrete, his loyal companion, a scruffy dog named Buddy, lying at his feet. The sight of Hank brought a smile to Chris's face. The man had a weathered look, but his eyes sparkled with a gentle wisdom. "Hey, Hank," Chris called out, waving as he approached. "Chris, good to see you, my friend," Hank replied, his voice raspy yet warm. "What do you have for me today?" Chris chuckled, kneeling down to unpack the bag. "Just some food I thought you might enjoy. Figured you could use a little pick-me-up." Hank's eyes lit up as he caught sight of the sandwiches. "You're spoiling me, you know that?" "I could get used to this," he said, taking a sandwich and offering one to Buddy, who wagged his tail eagerly. As they settled into their routine, Chris marveled at how easily their conversations flowed. They discussed everything from dreams lost and found to the struggles of life on the streets. Chris felt a deepening bond with Hank, one that transcended the boundaries of their differing circumstances. "Do you ever think about what you would do if money were no object?" Chris asked, taking a sip of his water. Hank pondered for a moment, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "I'd open a shelter, you know? A place where folks can find a warm bed and a hot meal. I'd make sure they feel like humans again, not just another statistic." Chris nodded, impressed by Hank's vision. "That's a beautiful dream. You really care about people." "It's all I've got left," Hank replied, his voice turning somber. "You see, I used to have it all. A job, a family. Then I lost everything, but I learned something important in the process. Helping others fills a void money never could." Their conversation shifted as Hank leaned back, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "There was a woman I helped a long time ago. She was in a rough spot, had a baby with her, lost everything after being abandoned. I remember how she looked, so frightened and lost." Chris felt a shiver run down his spine. The description resonated with him, but he dismissed it as mere coincidence. "What happened to her?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Hank shrugged. "I don't know. I helped her as best as I could, gave her some money and food. I hope she found her way back." "Did you ever see her again?" Chris inquired, his curiosity piqued. "No, but I think about her often. She had that spark, you know, like she was meant for more than this life. I wished I could do more for her." Chris felt a strange connection to Hank's story, one that tugged at him from the inside. He shook his head, trying to brush off the sensation. It was just a story, after all. It couldn't possibly relate to him or his life. As the evening deepened and stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Chris stood up, adjusting his jacket. "I'll see you again soon, Hank. Take care of yourself and Buddy." "Will do, my friend. And remember, it's the little things that matter," Hank smiled, waving him off. Chris walked home, his mind racing with thoughts of the evening. The fragility of life weighed heavily on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Hank's story than met the eye. As he reached his upscale apartment, he paused at the door, staring into the dimly lit hallway. What if there was a deeper connection between them? What if Hank's past held keys to his own? The questions lingered in his mind like a melody he couldn't quite place. He entered his home, but the warmth of the evening faded beneath the stark fluorescent lights. The emptiness returned, gnawing at him, making him question the life he'd built. The fragility of existence, the threads that connected their lives, and the weight of untold stories wrapped around him, making him realize that perhaps it was time to dig deeper into both Hank's past and his own. Chris sat at his polished mahogany desk, the glow from his laptop illuminating the deep furrows of contemplation etched across his brow. The cityscape outside his window was a blend of vibrant lights and shadowy corners, but his mind was far from the bustling world of business. It was anchored in the stories Hank had shared, stories of struggles, resilience, and an unwavering spirit of generosity that seemed to echo through the alleyways of his life. Driven by an insatiable curiosity, he decided it was time to dig deeper into Hank's past. He began his search by reaching out to local shelters and community centers, his fingers dancing across the keyboard as he sent emails and made phone calls. Each inquiry was met with varying degrees of enthusiasm or indifference, but Chris was undeterred. The more he learned about the city's support systems, the more he felt a responsibility to illuminate Hank's narrative. After hours of research, he stumbled upon a small but dedicated shelter that specialized in helping the homeless population. "Hello, I'm looking for information on a man named Hank," Chris said after connecting with the shelter's director. His voice was steady, laced with urgency. "I believe he may have been a part of your community for some time." The director's voice was warm but cautious. "Hank, you say?" There are many stories surrounding him. He's been known to help others, even when he has so little himself. But what exactly are you looking to find? Chris hesitated, the weight of his inquiry hanging in the air. I think he may have played a significant role in my family's history. Your family? The director sounded intrigued. That's interesting. I can't share specifics without Hank's consent, but there may be records of families he's helped. Would you like me to look? Yes, please. Chris replied, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he were afraid to disturb the fragile threads of fate he was weaving together. After a few days, the director called back, her voice tinged with excitement. Chris, I found something for you, an old newspaper article from about 20 years ago. It mentions a woman named Sarah who was homeless with her infant son, Chris. It details how a kind stranger helped them. Hank? Chris's heart raced. Could you send me a copy? The director agreed, and within hours, Chris was staring at the printed article, the faded ink almost shimmering with the weight of the past. The headline read, "Local Hero Helps Homeless Mother and Child," and as he read the words, a swell of emotion surged within him. The article painted a picture of his mother's struggles, the despair that had enveloped their lives, and the hope brought forth by a nameless face. Hank, Chris whispered, the name rolling off his tongue like a sacred incantation. He was no longer just a homeless man, he was a lifeline thrown to his mother during her darkest days. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, and he felt a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Armed with this newfound knowledge, Chris rushed home, his mind racing with questions. When he entered the house, he found his mother, Sarah, seated in the living room, surrounded by a sea of old photographs. The room was dimly lit, the golden hues of the setting sun spilling in through the window, casting delicate shadows that danced across her face. "Mom," Chris called softly, his heart pounding. "Can we talk?" She looked up, her eyes reflecting years of life, love, and loss. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" Chris took a deep breath, steadying himself for the conversation that lay ahead. "I've been learning about someone named Hank. The article I found, it mentioned you. It said he helped you when you were struggling." At the mention of Hank's name, Sarah's expression shifted from curiosity to something deeper, a flicker of recognition mixed with a wave of emotion. "Hank?" she murmured, her voice trembling. "Yes, he did. He was our angel." Chris felt a knot form in his throat as he absorbed her words. "What happened, Mom? Can you tell me about him?" Tears welled in her eyes, and she nodded slowly, as if unearthing buried memories. "It was a time when everything felt hopeless. I was lost, scared, and didn't know how I would care for you. And then there he was. Hank showed up, offering food and comfort. He never asked for anything in return." "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Chris asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I wanted to protect you from that part of our past," she explained, her voice breaking. "But Hank, he was the one who believed in us when no one else did. He gave me hope." Chris felt the weight of their intertwined destinies crashing down upon him. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and the realization that Hank, the man he had come to admire, had once saved his mother's life was overwhelming. He looked at her, a myriad of emotions swirling within him, anger, sadness, but most importantly, gratitude. "Mom, I think we need to find him. We have to thank him," Chris said, determination igniting in his chest. Sarah nodded, a smile breaking through her tears. "Yes, we do. It's time to repay that kindness." Chris stood in the living room, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. His mother, Sarah, had been staring at old photographs, the edges of the frames worn and the images faded, much like the memories they held. As he approached her, he felt a mix of anticipation and dread. He had unearthed a truth that rocked the foundation of his understanding of both his mother and the enigmatic Hank. "Mom," he started, his voice a gentle whisper. "Can we talk about Hank?" At the sound of his voice, Sarah's gaze fell from the photographs to the floor. The silence stretched out, thick with unspoken words. Finally, she looked up, her blue eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "You found out, didn't you?" Chris nodded slowly, the gravity of the moment settling heavily on his chest. "The article, it mentioned you and me. It said Hank helped us when we were in such a dark place. I never wanted you to know about that part of my life," Sarah admitted, her voice trembling. "It was hard, Chris. I wanted to protect you from those memories." Tears began to stream down her cheeks, and Chris felt his heart ache for the woman who had always been his rock. But Mom, it's important. Hank was there for us when we had no one else. How did he save us? Sarah took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts as she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. It was years ago. I was young and scared. Your father had left, and I was left alone with you. We had nowhere to go. I remember sitting on a bench with you in my arms, feeling hopeless. Then what happened? Chris urged, leaning closer, desperate to understand how Hank had intertwined their lives so profoundly. Sarah's voice softened, nostalgia creeping into her words. Hank approached us. He was different from the others, you know? He didn't look at us with pity, he looked at us with compassion. He gave me his last few dollars, which I fought to refuse, but he insisted. He said that kindness was meant to be shared. I was so embarrassed, but I accepted it. That little bit of money bought us food and a place to stay for a few nights. Chris felt a surge of admiration for Hank, who had once been a stranger yet had profoundly impacted their lives. But he was homeless himself. How could he afford to help us? Sarah chuckled lightly through her tears, a bittersweet smile breaking through the sadness. That was Hank. He lived to help others even when he had nothing. He showed me that kindness can exist even in the darkest places. We eventually got back on our feet, but I promised myself I would never forget his generosity. As the weight of their story settled over them, Chris felt a fire ignite within him, a determination to repay that kindness. Mom, I think we need to bring Hank back into our lives. We can help him now, just like he helped us. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. Chris, are you sure? He's been living on the streets for so long. What if he doesn't want our help? What if he's changed? He hasn't changed, Mom, Chris replied, conviction in his voice. He's still the same man who cared for us when we had nothing. If we have the chance to help him, we need to take it. Sarah nodded slowly, her expression shifting from apprehension to something resembling hope. You're right. We owe him that much, but how do we find him? I've been visiting him regularly. I can take you to meet him. He deserves to know how much he meant to us. Sarah wiped her eyes again and took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. Okay, let's do it. Let's find Hank. As they stood together, the bond between mother and son grew stronger, intertwined with the threads of shared history and a commitment to kindness. Chris felt a sense of purpose, knowing that this journey would not only bring them closer to Hank, but would also heal wounds he hadn't realized were still open. Let's make it right, he said softly, his heart swelling with hope. Together they prepared to change the course of their lives and honor the man who had once lifted them from despair. Chris stood in his elegantly decorated dining room, the soft glow of candlelight casting warm shadows on the walls. The table was set for 3, adorned with fine china and crystal glasses, a stark contrast to the life Hank had known for so long. His heart raced with anticipation and trepidation as he glanced at the door, waiting for Hank to arrive. Chris could hardly fathom the weight of the moment. Bringing the man who had once saved his mother's life into his home felt surreal. When Hank finally stepped through the threshold, he looked out of place in the opulent surroundings. His clothes were worn but clean, and his eyes held a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Wow, this is something else, Hank muttered, taking a step inside. Chris could see him absorbing the atmosphere, his gaze wandering over the decorations as if he were entering a different world. Welcome, Hank, Chris said, extending a hand. I'm really glad you could come. Thanks for having me, I guess, Hank replied, shaking Chris's hand firmly but hesitantly. As they moved to the dining table, Sarah emerged from the kitchen carrying a steaming dish of pasta. Her eyes met Hank's, and a wave of recognition washed over her. The moment felt electric, filled with unsaid words and emotions. Hank, she finally said, her voice trembling. It's been so long. Sarah, Hank responded softly, his expression shifting from surprise to warmth. I didn't know you'd be here. I wanted to be here, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You helped us when we needed it most. Hank's eyes glistened as he took a seat at the table. I just did what felt right, he replied, shrugging off the compliment. I didn't think much of it back then. Maybe you should have, Chris interjected, pouring Hank a glass of wine. You changed our lives, Hank. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for your kindness. They began to share stories, laughter spilling into the room like sunlight. Hank recounted tales of his life on the streets, moments of joy mixed with hardship. There was this one winter, he started, his voice steady. I found a group of kids who were freezing. I had one blanket and I just couldn't keep it to myself. Something told me to share it, it warmed them up, and their laughter made it all worth it. Sarah listened intently, her eyes glistening with tears. You always had a heart of gold, Hank, she said, wiping her cheeks, even when things were tough for you. Hank shifted uncomfortably, looking down at his plate. I don't know, Sarah. Sometimes it felt like I was just trying to survive. I didn't want to be a burden to anyone. Burden, Chris echoed, leaning forward. You're not a burden, you're family. We want to help you, Hank. Please don't think that way. Hank paused, taking in their words. His defenses slowly began to crumble, and he let out a deep sigh. I've always been afraid that accepting help would make me dependent on others. I fought for so long to stay independent. Sarah reached out, placing a hand on Hank's. We're not trying to take anything away from you. We want to support you like you did for us. It's okay to let people in. It's okay to be vulnerable. Hank looked up, meeting Sarah's gaze. The warmth in her eyes was undeniable, and for the first time he felt a flicker of hope igniting within him. I've just been alone for so long, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. It's hard to change that. Chris picked up his glass, raising it slightly. To new beginnings, then, he said, his tone earnest. To family and friendship. We're all in this together. As they clinked their glasses together, Hank felt a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced in years. The weight of his past began to lift, replaced by the warmth of connection. Okay, he finally said, a smile breaking through. I'll give it a shot. I'll stay for a while. The words hung in the air, a promise that opened the door to a new chapter. Laughter filled the dining room again, mingling with the scent of home-cooked pasta and the sound of clinking silverware. And in that moment, surrounded by the people he had once helped, Hank realized that he was not just a survivor, he was part of a family bound by kindness, resilience, and love. As Chris and Hank spent more time together, the layers of their lives began to unravel, revealing unexpected depths. Chris was particularly fascinated to learn that Hank was not just a man of the streets, he was also an artist. One afternoon, as they sat in Chris's spacious living room, Hank hesitated before pulling out a worn sketchbook from his backpack. The pages were filled with vibrant murals he had painted around the city, each a testament to his talent and a reflection of the struggles he had faced. Wow, Hank, these are incredible, Chris exclaimed, flipping through the pages. You have a real gift. Why haven't you shown these to anyone? Hank shrugged, a hint of embarrassment creeping into his expression. I don't know, man. I guess I never thought anyone would care. Just some scribbles to pass the time, you know? Not just scribbles, Chris countered, his eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. You could have a gallery showing. You deserve to have your art seen by the world. You could inspire others. Hank looked down, contemplating the idea. A gallery? I don't know. What if no one shows up? What if they don't like it? Let's not think about the what ifs, Chris encouraged. Let's focus on what could be. You have a story to tell, and your art can do that. I'll help you set it up. Their conversation was interrupted by the sudden buzz of Hank's phone. He glanced at the screen and his heart raced. The caller ID read Maggie. His estranged sister, someone he hadn't heard from in years. Nervousness washed over him, and he hesitated before answering. Hello? He said cautiously. Hank? Is that you? Her voice was shaky but filled with urgency. Maggie? He couldn't believe it. I thought you were lost. I didn't even know you were looking for me. Of course I've been looking for you. I've tried every way I could think of to find you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I need to see you. It's important. Chris watched as Hank's face transformed from shock to a mix of confusion and hope. What's going on? Why now? I can't explain everything over the phone. Can we meet? I'm back in the city and I need you to understand. After hanging up, Hank felt overwhelmed. I haven't seen her in years, Chris. I thought she was gone for good. Do you want to meet her? Chris asked gently, sensing the turmoil inside Hank. I think it could be a good thing. I don't know, Hank replied, running his hands through his hair anxiously. What if things are different? What if she resents me? Whatever happens, you're not alone. You have us now, Chris reassured him. This could be a chance for healing. Later that week, they arranged to meet at a small cafe. a neutral ground where Hank could feel safe. Chris and Sarah joined him for support, their presence a comforting reminder of the family they had built. As they arrived, Hank spotted Maggie sitting at a corner table, her back to him. His heart raced as he approached her. "Maggie?" he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned, her eyes lighting up with recognition and disbelief. "Hank! I can't believe it's really you." She stood up, tears streaming down her face as they embraced tightly, their long-lost bond rekindled in an instant. As they sat down, the conversation began to flow, filled with laughter and tears. Hank learned that Maggie had been searching for him ever since their mother passed away, trying to piece together their fragmented family history. But as they spoke, something clicked in Hank's mind. "Wait a minute," he said, his brow furrowing. You helped Sarah, didn't you, when she was on the streets?" Maggie's eyes widened in shock. "You know Sarah. I didn't realize you were connected to her." Chris and Sarah exchanged glances, the connections between their lives weaving a tapestry of compassion and support. "She was my mother," Chris said, his voice steady. "Hank helped us both when we were in need, and now we're here for him." The realization washed over them, intertwining their paths in a way that was both miraculous and profound. "It's like fate has brought us together," Maggie whispered, wiping her tears. "We've all been searching for each other in different ways." As they spoke, the barriers that had once kept them apart began to dissolve. The reunion was not just a meeting of siblings, but a convergence of lives that had been touched by kindness. Together they laughed, shared stories, and began to heal the wounds of the past. In that moment, Chris, Hank, Sarah, and Maggie realized that their acts of kindness had forged connections that transcended their individual struggles. Each had been a beacon of light for the others when darkness loomed. The simplicity of love and generosity had created a new family, bound not by blood but by the shared experiences of hardship and hope, a bond that would continue to grow in ways they could never have imagined. The bottom line is true wealth is in human connection and kindness regardless of circumstances. It shows how small acts of generosity can have profound and lasting impacts, and how people who seem distant and unknown can be deeply intertwined in our lives. Furthermore, the text highlights the importance of gratitude, of giving and receiving help, and how these actions can transform lives, creating bonds that go beyond difficulties or material success.